Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. We know that it is still very early for the weekend, but all the more, we are very grateful for your coming and joining the room. Today, again, we've got Timothy Langley. He's going to walk us through the latest developments in the Japanese politics, things which are important for you, for your business, your work. And this is the 8th installment, I believe, of this room. And we hope that you enjoy it and learn from it as much as you did, the previous times. So Timothy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Maya. And I apologize, last week I had internet problems and fell off a little bit, so I hope that doesn't happen today. Just as a heads up, I think everybody knows we've got this room on Japanese politics that will go until 9 o'clock, and then from 9 o'clock until we don't have an end date because it's probably going to be a very interesting and wide-reaching discussion. We've got a room on espionage in Japan, and I've got a guest, Robert Whiting, to join me on that. And a lot of people have expressed interest in that because he's a famous author on a lot of things about Japan. You got to have WA or Tokyo Underworld. He's for a long, long time. We'll sign off as quickly as possible before 9 o'clock to start that room. And of course, everybody's invited if you're interested in that aspect of doing business in Japan. So today, talking about Japanese politics, it's a recurring theme. I think everybody knows those things that really are important to you as a person who lives in Japan or who's interested in what's going on in Japan. Politics is somewhat esoteric and distant, but what we try and do here is talk about those things that are important to you, that really touch us. And there's a lot to talk about, but you can get kind of lost in the detail. So and the reason why we talk about them is because they do have relevance. The kind of 5 or 6 things are the Olympics. The Olympics always come up. What's the political angle on that? COVID. What's the Suga administration doing? How long will it last? Will Mr. Suga become prime minister again? What's going on with China? The Japan relationship with China, and to a lesser extent, Taiwan. And the U.S.-Japan relationship is always front and center. So that's an important thing. So let me talk about all of these things and try and wrap them into a story that makes sense and everything means something to the other ones. So with regard to COVID, you know that Osaka is just getting hammered. They are actually in the middle of their 4th wave. And Tokyo is looking at this and very, very nervous because they do not want to call a 3rd emergency for the city, which means closing down eating establishments, maybe closing schools, an emergency situation. They just don't want it. And the reason why they don't want it is because there are things that are coming up. State of emergency, the impact on that globally is very big, and the people who are attempting to send teams to the Olympics might have a second thought. Also, the controversy between the United States and China with regard to the 2022 Winter Olympics in China. They're talking now about boycotting. The United States is talking about that. And once again, like Japan is looking at Osaka with their 4th wave, they're also looking at the United States. Are you guys going to actually boycott? And if you boycott, what is our role? Must we follow you? And if we do, we're a lot closer to China than you guys are. And it's just diplomatically, it's awful tough to project now, a year away, that we're not going to go to the Winter Olympics, and our Olympics haven't been held. And also Myanmar, what are we going to do? Are we still supporting? And in quotes, supporting the Myanmar government while the civil war is going on. The Japanese haven't made a decision there. And if you're following the news, you see this kind of perplexity within the Japanese foreign ministry about how to deal with Myanmar. They're watching it very carefully. There's a lot of Japanese business there, and they haven't really staked a claim about supporting the opposition or the military party that's holding dictatorial power. So these things all conflate for this decision about the Olympics and the boycott and that sort of thing. But in any event, Mr. Taro Kono, the minister of, he's in the cabinet minister of, what is he, the minister of economic policy or something like that. He has been tasked by the prime minister with COVID rollout, and his hands are kind of tied now because of the distribution of, not the distribution, but the arrival of the vaccines into Japan. So he is committed that in June, everybody that's 65 years and older will start getting them. There are several million vials that are coming in. Right now, first responders are being treated, and probably by June, it seems such a long way away. And according to comparisons with other advanced countries, Japan is just so far behind. One of the reasons there is, just the Japanese suspicion, the population suspicion about injections and the government being involved in that sort of thing. There's been a lot of bad cases in the past, so it is somewhat reluctant, but the people want it. And the other is just the administration of trade and ministry. It sure would be nice if we Japanese could develop this vaccine ourselves. So we're working really hard on it. And maybe we'll come up with something, but more likely not. But the better scenario is, why don't we force AstraZeneca or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson to manufacture here in Japan, send the IP here, so that it increases our productivity and our technological advancement, rather than sending money, which the Japanese, as you know, hate to do. They prefer to do it here or do without. So there's that bit of controversy going on. Moving on, as you know, the Prime Minister will go to the United States on the 16th. He'll spend 3 days there. They land, they probably go to sleep, maybe have a dinner, and then a full day, and then the next day a couple of roundup meetings, and then they leave. So it's a very short trip, a short delegation, but it's very important for us to watch. One of the things that will be important in the Suga Biden meeting is who's in the room with the delegation. We're all very curious. We haven't had an ambassador in the Tokyo embassy for a while, and it's most likely he hasn't appointed anybody. There's nobody in the pipeline that's been identified. He's just getting his administration going, and probably ambassadorships are a little bit far down the line of priorities. But the future ambassador will probably be in the room. So that's something to watch. The other thing that's important to us is, you may know that the Biden administration is very heavy on the environment. They're going to reduce the carbon footprint. They're going to tax people. They're going to have a new energy commission, so that the workers who were working on the oil pipeline now can switch jobs and work on the new economy, the green economy. There's a tremendous push there, and he's earmarked a lot of money for that. Suga, of course, needs to be close to the U.S. president, and he's, I guess, kissing up, is you might be able to say. So he's come up with his proposal for meeting carbon emissions. So initially it was, we're going to have carbon emissions reduced by 30% or 40% by 2050. That's so far into the future, I can't even think about it. But now he's changed that and he said, we're going to do it to 40% by 2030. He's very about that. He is the first foreign leader to visit with Biden, so that's a big thing. So it's something that should be watched. We've got the Global Climate Summit coming up on April 16th, which is, I'm sorry, it's not April 16th. It's I think it's in May 1st. So that's a big deal too. The United States and Japan figuring out some sort of partnership so that they can capture that spin. Mr. Biden and Mr. Suga, the relationship there has a lot of impact on how Suga is perceived here in Japan. So he really wants to make a good impression, and he wants to come back, quote unquote, victorious. He's struggling, as you know, with elections. He has 2 elections that are coming in September or August, depending. One is for the lower house. The lower house will end its 4-year term in August. On, let me see, August 21st. So there must be an election that's held then. He does have the opportunity to call a House election at any time between there. And the problem with that is that if he calls an election and the LDP doesn't do very well, then his administration is headed to the trash bin. And he has, first of all, the election of all of the House of Representative members. And then he has his election, an LDP election, who decides who's going to be the prime minister. So if he doesn't do well in this House of Representatives election and the LDP slips, which it's already predicted to do, how bad it slips will be blamed on him and his administration. Then he's out. So with that perspective, working backwards, what does he have going for him that could possibly be something great? And it could be the Biden trip, which is just this week. It could be COVID relief. It could be the Olympics. We've talked about this all the time. We're always looking for something that's good that's going to happen. But there are a lot of things that could happen that are bad. So he's really in a tight situation. And just to remind you, we have a by-election on the 25th of this month. There are 3 important ones that will be bellwethers for how the prime minister is doing. And the LDP has decided or promised to the Tokyo administration, the Tokyo government, that for 2 months before the election on July 4th, for the Tokyo municipal election, 2 months beforehand and 2 months afterwards, the LDP will not call elections. So that's a 4-month span where the LDP, where Mr. Suga cannot call elections if he follows his promise. The first 2 months are to allow the Tokyo metropolitan government and the candidates to work up for their election. And then the 2 months afterwards is kind of, we're going to be exhausted from those elections, and it would be unfair for you to hold a national election while we're still, we spent all our money on the Tokyo Olympics, Tokyo elections. And if you call a national election now, that's unfair. So apparently they extracted that sort of promise. So the window of opportunity for the prime minister to call an election when he thinks he might have an advantage is between now and May 4th, a very short window. He's got the Biden trip coming up. He's got the by-elections on the 25th. So that window of opportunity doesn't look very good. And following that, on September 4th, he's got, if his promise is kept that I won't hold an election 2 months afterward, that puts us at September 4th. There's just so little opportunity there. Between that period of time, the Tokyo Olympics will be held. If you're following the news, the release of the contaminated water in Fukushima is a huge issue. It needs to be released into the sea at some point, and there's a lot of pressure to do that. And the prime minister has other concerns about, his political standing that conflicts with safety and, conservation of the seas and that sort of thing. So China, Korea, not Taiwan, but China, Korea, I think Vietnam too, have banned all goods coming out of Vietnam. I'm sorry, coming out of Fukushima. So that whole prefecture, the growth of produce for export, and also the fishing has been banned. So if he releases if he acknowledges the release, that will be a huge black eye for him. So I hope you kind of get a picture of he's just in really a tight spot. The by-elections, let me talk about those because they're very important. There are 3 of them that are happening on the 25th. So there's a 14-day election window, and that starts now. So the elections in Nagano, in Hiroshima, and Hokkaido are going to be starting. There'll be an election on the 25th in 2 weeks' time. So in Nagano, there's, if you remember, Mr. Hatta used to be the prime minister, and he was from Nagano. And so his oldest son ran for an upper house seat there, and he won. And then he was the first member of the parliament to die of COVID. And his seat is open, and so they need to run an election there. So the LDP should be very strong there, but they don't have a very good candidate list. So what happened is, it was Mr. Hatta, the prime minister of Japan. His eldest son ran, he died of COVID. And now the LDP has selected his other brother, or his brother, to be the candidate. So he's running against a Komeito candidate. So the tension here is the LDP and Komeito. So the LDP holds a supermajority in the upper house and a majority in the lower house, only because it has a coalition with Komeito. And one of the reasons why the Tokyo metropolitan government was able to extract this 2 month beforehand and 2 month afterward promise was because Komeito was supporting it. And Komeito is very strong in Tokyo elections, and it wants to retain that. And it doesn't want to spend all of its money in the Tokyo elections, and then the prime minister holds a snap election, and it's just too much in terms of money and exhaustion. So in Nagano, it's a toss-up. It's something to watch, and it's a real toss-up. Komeito versus Mr. Hatta, the second son of the former prime minister. In Hiroshima, this is a sad case because Anli Kawai, you might remember, the wife of the the justice minister, was arrested for bribery. She resigned from the Diet, and therefore this seat is open. So it's in the upper house, and they will be individual. This is going to be tightly fought because this election district belongs to Mr. Kishida, who was a former foreign minister. He has quietly, sometimes not quietly, said he would like to be prime minister after Mr. Abe. That got him into a little bit of trouble. And his star has fallen a lot since then. If he doesn't win, if the LDP doesn't win in Hiroshima, this will be not only a black mark against the LDP, but more importantly against Kishida. And if there is, or when there is an election for prime minister, if the LDP candidate, Mr. Nishida, doesn't win in Hiroshima, you will not see Mr. Kishida, his name, as a potential for prime minister. In Hokkaido, Hokkaido is so bad that they're not even going to run a candidate. The LDP is not going to run a candidate. You might recall that in Hokkaido, the former trade minister was elected to the House, the seat there. And he got caught in a bribery scandal from an egg manufacturer from Akita. So he resigned in disgrace, and so the LDP said this is just it's too much to even put a candidate there because we're going to lose in any event. So how the prime minister acts on the snap election will be dependent on these 3 seats, and I don't see it happening. More interestingly, let's say there is an election for the House. It runs its course maybe at the constitutionally assigned date, and then the prime minister, the election for prime minister within LDP starts. So Mr. Suga is a big question mark. As you know, he doesn't have a political faction that belongs to him. He's really reliant on Nikai-san to help support him. And you think about who the potential candidates are, and everybody likes to talk about Kono Taro. He's in the Aso faction, but if Mr. Suga decides to run, Japanese politics decorum dictate that if you're in the administration of the guy who's running, or if he is, if one of the people in your political faction is running, one of your superiors, you can't run, you shouldn't run. It's more likely to happen not in a political faction because those are tightly controlled, but in the administration where the prime minister is seeking to succeed himself and somebody on his cabinet runs against him, that is seen as bad politics, bad form. So it doesn't happen. It's happened maybe once in the past, not successfully, of course. So if somebody wants to run for prime minister, they must resign their seat first, and then that signals to everybody, oh, okay, I know what's going on now. So Mr. Kono Taro is in the cabinet. So without Mr. Suga's blessing or without resigning from the cabinet, which he is unlikely to do, he's not going to be a candidate. Let's say Mr. Suga decides not to run, then the door is open, the other candidates come out. That's, it could happen. There could be a vote of no confidence with the prime minister between now and then. But the other prospect that is beginning to build momentum is an Abe comeback, which is really interesting. And when you look at all of the things that are available, even though some people dislike Mr. Abe, he did have a long term and he's already a historical figure, and there's still a lot more that he wants to do. He resigned because of health. He doesn't seem to be that sick. It might have just been a ploy to avoid all the nastiness of COVID and the cancellation of the Olympics and that sort of thing. So he assigned Mr. Suga as a holdover administrator. It is possible, and it's an interesting thing to think about. It's something that we should all watch. Let me try and wrap this part up by talking about China and Japan. The Chinese have modified their Coast Guard law to allow their cutters, their Coast Guard cutters, to now carry weapons and to fire on ships that it perceives to be intruding on China's territorial waters. This is really upsetting because there's a lot of disputes with regard to the Spratlys, with regard to the artificial reefs. The United States is very concerned about that. They have done war games. They've done many war games with a conflict in this region where the Chinese have decided to make a move on some of their territorial claims, and it calls in the United States to defend the Japanese waters or Japanese territory as the U.S.-Japan defense agreement dictates. War games have always, they're just war games, so it's just calculations and scenarios, but in no instance has the United States defeated China in this region in air and sea. So there could be a stopgap measure that's pushed, but the Chinese, they just have too much, they're developing naval forces that eclipse, they are as great as France's entire naval armaments every year. So every year they're just growing. So in this region, they're very highly bulked up and ready for lots of action should it occur. Taiwan has been, before any conflict, you can always see the telltale signs. There's probes, there's incursions and then escapes and that sort of thing. There's taunting. And this is happening right now, not only in Taiwan, but also in Japan too. So they send fighters or bomber groups. They break through international space claimed by Taiwan or by Japan, and then they just scoot on back after they've already scrambled jets. So this is happening increasingly frequent in the Taiwan Straits. And it's happening not just with fighters and bombers, submarine surveillance airplanes, and also the fleet, the Armada, is making incursions as well. So people are really nervous there. The United States is watching. They've sent, I'm not sure if it's the Sixth Fleet, but they've sent a fleet of warships through the Taiwan Straits just as a show of force. Once again, that's made China mad. China's mad about everything, anything that they can complain about. They're mad that Suga is meeting with the prime minister. I'm sorry, Suga is meeting with Biden. So the tensions are really high there. Myanmar also plays a role. What will the Japanese do? I think the reason why they haven't been more demonstrative is because they're really worried about how things will be perceived by China. So it's a really delicate thing, and you put all of these together, and Mr. Suga is in a real tight spot. Finally, I'd just like to touch upon an issue that comes up quite a bit. The imperial family, they have an issue with the marriage of the prince's daughter with Mr. Komura, who was working in a Tokyo law firm as a not associate. He's not a lawyer. And that marriage kind of broke off because of a lot of things that were revealed about Mr. Komura's background, his financial background, his mother's financial background, especially. So the wedding was called off. He went to the United States to go to law school to become a lawyer. He's not past the bar yet, but he's in the news. This is just one aspect of women in Japanese society. Will there be a woman on the throne? It's in terms of numbers, it's more likely for that to happen. But there's just a lot of resistance, cultural resistance here. But I have to say that things are changing very quickly here. You can live in Japan for a long time and complain that nothing happens. It's just, people just don't do anything. It's, the society is stuck. But actually, things happen pretty quickly here. If you leave Japan and then come back a year or 2 years later, you notice it. It changes very quickly. So the issue with EQ and the role, I don't mean to conflate that with women in politics. There's a huge area of society that is left out. It's always the men running things. Japan is, among all of the G7, the lowest participation of women in politics, less than 8% members of the Diet. And so there is a great push here for recognition. And Ms. Inada, who used to be a defense minister, is promoting a law. So in Hokkaido, there was a law that said you can have same-sex marriages, and they can be registered. And this is a big deal. They have the same thing in Shibuya, but in Hokkaido, this is providing impetus for more movement on letting women, decide their own roles. And so there's a law being considered to relax this. It has lots of push being sponsored by the former defense minister. And there's just a lot going on in Japanese society with regard to women in the workplace, same name marriages, where the woman has to give up her name and she can't assume her own name during marriage. The role of women in boardrooms, that sort of thing. So it's something to keep your eye on. I don't know if we've reached a tipping point, but I sense that we are closely reaching that. Probably maybe this time next year, you'll see a more significant change. But it's an interesting time to be in Japan, and it's always fun to watch how things are being handled and what Japanese politics is dictating to the rest of us. So with that, I'd like to close it up and ask for comments or questions. And just to remind you, we have another room at 9 o'clock, so we're going to try and wrap this up at around 8:50 or so.
Thank you, Timothy. I have a question. Well, before I pose it, so I would like to, everybody in the room, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll let you up on stage to talk with Timothy. And well, while we are waiting, I have, well, my question is, so what about the LGBT community in Japan? Because I think that, well, what are the political implications with, well, passing laws to allow same-sex marriages, and also the one, I mean, the law which you touched upon about women, giving
Yes.
them the right to choose their family name after marriage. So there is a lot of movement, a lot of talk about this, but well, and as you said, there are laws, well, and probably bills, you know, which will be passed in the near future. But still, do you think that the cultural resistance is more on political level than, you know, on, well, in the general public?
The reason why I like this issue and the reason why I highlighted it is because LGBT is a more difficult thing to manage or pass through than women, just the women issue, right? But even though they've a lot of emphasis in it and they've named women to the cabinet, it's just bluster, and it's powerful. It's not really beginning to take hold. But if on the I say fringes, but it's not meant to be pejorative. On the fringes, LGBT, if that's an issue that's beginning to take a momentum, it shows that there is a concern about those people who aren't allowed to participate in Japanese society, Japanese business, Japanese politics, only because of prejudicial layovers from, I don't know, the 20th century, maybe the 17th century. So the point here is that as a sign of things that are changing, this is really big, and it is building momentum. I wish that there was much more emphasis on the women's issue, but that's not to say that there's a lot of emphasis on that. A lot of things are happening. But it is interesting to me that LGBT is getting that much prominence. So I think that although the two are not tied together, I sense that they are tied together in terms of distributing how society decides itself what's going to happen and who's going to be teaching and who's going to be the bread earner and who has to do the cooking and those sorts of things. So it's very much ingrained, as you know very well, because you live it yourself. There are changes. There's a lot of frustration in this country about that, mostly in the bigger cities. But I do sense that there is movement being made.
Thank you. And another thing about, well, the female monarch. So there is, well, it's in the news anyway, that the government is under pressure to talk about it and to decide whether the imperial succession, you know, will be, well, let's say whether they would let, you know, a female to be the monarch, so
right,
that they can secure, you know, a stable imperial succession. And then, of course, a lot of critiques, they say that probably Suga's government is not going to do anything about it. So, well, it looks like the government of Mr. Suga, it doesn't have much time actually with so many issues on the table and the very little time left until the elections. But do you think that there are any other reasons as well, or is it just the timeline about, yeah.
You're talking about the succession?
Yes, I am. Yes, about that. Yes.
So succession is, and I really encourage everybody to follow the Komura situation. It's just interesting. It reveals a dynamic of what's going on with the imperial family, and with it doesn't have that much to do with succession. It's a different aspect, but it is really interesting tug of war that's going on. But this whole thing with the succession is, I think, almost solely dictated by the imperial household, and the prime minister does have some input into this issue, but it far is surpassed by the imperial household law and by what the imperial agency or the household agency is doing, and also what the royal family should be done. So I think that, yeah, in the current administration, Mr. Suga is too occupied with other things. It is something to keep your eye on. There is a minister of the household agency in his cabinet, but I think it's just one of those things that he should leave, to its own designs. There's very little I think he should. I mean, it's just a hotbed of controversy.
Thank you. Well, I would like to encourage everybody who has a question or would like to discuss the topics which Timothy talked about to raise their hand and come up on stage. Well, it seems that...
Or where to volunteer. You remember Mr. Suga's son was kind of captured in a not a bribery scandal, but in a lobbying scandal with the telecommunications ministry.
Yes.
The fallout from there just has not stopped. The most recent thing that's happened is the Fuji Media empire. You might remember that because Horiemon, who purchased Fuji Media and got into so much trouble. You might remember that story. It's the same industry. It's the same company, actually. But now... there's a law against the foreigners holding more than 20% in media, in several strategic industries, media being one of them. And so, the company that Mr. Suga's son worked in, it lost its license. It looks like there's just retribution to be paid because this issue was brought up. So I think the lesson here is, and you see it all the time, you see it with what happened with Olympus. You see it what happened to Nissan, Toyota, and what's happening now with Toshiba. So Toshiba looks like it's going to be sold. It's suffering from shareholder insecurities. But once you kind of rattle the cage and you violate the law or you become a target of scandal, it just never seems to end. It just goes on and on. And so people are very, very reluctant to let that sort of thing happen. That's why at the boardroom level, you have so much security and secrecy, and why you're trying to find out what your enemies are plotting against you and that sort of thing. So there's this aspect of protection and ignoring wrongdoings and then burning files so that you don't get incriminated. That is kind of an interesting aspect that probably happens in other countries.
I hope that you can hear me. It seems that I have a connection problem now. So please let me know if you do, Timothy.
It's just difficult to appreciate them without a perspective of other things happening at the same time.
Thank you. Okay, once again, I'm trying to see if somebody would like to comment or share an opinion on this.
So we will be closing this room pretty soon to launch into the 9 o'clock room on espionage in Japan. The reason why we're hosting a room on espionage in Japan is because it comes up quite a bit in our conversations on Japanese politics. So I thought rather than taking some time out of our discussion on purely Japanese politics, that we would have a separate room for that. And as you may know, or as you may not know, Robert Whiting will be in that room with us, and he's a pretty interesting guy, former intelligence guy himself. I hope that you join us in that room. And finally, you know, for questions and comments, if we're not hitting the hot spots that you want to hear about, just let us know. Raise your hand and tell us you want to hear more about, you know, UFOs or something, and we'll try and weave that in. Hello, Paul. Hello, Tomoko.
Hi, my question is, you mentioned the coming the LGBT election. Well, currently we have no idea whether Suga can win again. At the same time, you mentioned about Kishida, and it's depending upon whether he can manage to make Hiroshima successful enough for LDP. Also, you mentioned about Cold Taro, and I don't think he wants to make really big differences right now. I don't think he will run the election anyway, just because. But even anybody do something, it won't work anyway because of the COVID-19 and too many issues on stake. But do you think, and also you mentioned about Abe, and I have no idea whether he, well, I know some people start talking about Abe's top round.
Yeah.
Do you think, I don't remember his name. Also, is coming back again?
No.
Really?
No.
I thought he never died. His ambition to be in the power never die. So that, of course, he is a kind of success driver always, being the vice president of LCP. And he is always trying to make statement about I'm in charge kind of things.
Yep.
So I thought he was also thinking, or he is still thinking about running his second term.
No, it's not going to happen.
What makes you believe that he won?
Okay, let me respond to that. You've got a couple of issues wrapped up in it, and then I'd like to get Cole up with your question. So, if you remember, the LDP has been in power ever since the end of the war, except for a very brief period, right? And that very brief period was preceded by an ASO administration. When he was prime minister and the election was called, that's when they fell out of power. And they were out of power until Mr. Abe came back. So Mr. Aso, he's older than Mr. Abe. He is one of the wealthiest parliamentarians. He is right now Minister of Finance and Vice Prime Minister. I think he would rather be the Kagemusha, the guy in the shadows, the taxi driver. You're right. And in his faction is Konotaro. So rather than him doing it, and he has lots of attributes that people just don't like, I think that it would be difficult for him where it wouldn't be as difficult with Mr. Kono. The problem with Mr. Kono is that it's not his decision. If he wants to run to become prime minister, that's not his decision. Somebody else will tell him that. And also the dynamics will dictate that. I hope that responds to your question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, man.
Hey, President. Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Hey, I have a question regarding the vaccination program and the announcement by Minister Konotaro on Friday about there were words to the effect of securing a supply for 36 million people over the age of 65 by the end of June.
Right.
The Japan Times says that the vaccine program starts tomorrow, Monday, and what Konotaro meant was that the supply will be secured so that the program can be completed by the end of June. However, I think your earlier mention and also some other commentary in media implies that actually securing supply by the end of June indicates the start, whereas I've read that it indicates the finish. Can you clarify anything more around that?
No. There's so much confusion there. There's so much confusion there. Mr. Kono wants to be upbeat. He wants people to focus on what he's doing and how much work he's investing in this and how he's going to save, the 65 years and older population first, and then work with the rest of the Japanese population after. There is tension there that starting the process and then actually putting needles in arms, there is a lag there. So first of all, they have to have the distribution by prefecture, and then the prefectures will administer it. And they're putting in place how they get the cards to every individual person. First the people who are over 65. So you get a card from Kuyacho or from Shiacho that says you've been selected for vaccine. Please show up on June 1st. It seems to me that can be moved up if the vaccines are already here physically in Japan, but that seems to be part of the question. So once they arrive, they do have a shelf life as long as you're keeping them, frozen in the manner that they're supposed to be, but they do have a bit of a shelf life, so you do want to get them out. But I thought when you started this question, because I get this a lot, will foreigners be, there's some thought that foreigners will be discriminated against and that the Japanese will get the first bite. And that is, there's nothing to that theory that the foreigners will get treated any differently from the Japanese nationals. So everybody will be treated the same as long as you're registered as a resident in Japan, you'll be treated the same. I hope that responds, Cole.
Yeah, I didn't ask that question, but okay, thanks for that. So just to be clear, the starting tomorrow and concluding by the end of June is not quite that's what it's going to be. we'll likely see maybe supply secured by the end of June, but actual needles and arms could be, quite a bit.
Starting tomorrow is inaccurate. Physically and logistically, it's impossible. There's more preparation that needs to be done.
Okay, thanks for that, Tim.
Yes, if you allow me to add, the other day on Thursday this week we talked with Christian Bocher, and he's involved in the rollout program, and his expectations are that probably the senior people in Japan, the ones 60 and over, will be vaccinated by the end of summer, or this timeline may be pushed back a little bit. So because, Timothy, as you said, there are a lot of, it's about the supply of vaccines.
Logistics, yeah.
Yes, and also, logistics. So digitalization and also paperwork, and there are a lot of things to be considered as well. Okay, I hope that this also helps, this bit of information helps. And I would like to say it's 8:51, so I would like to let Timothy go and get ready for the other room. So everybody, thank you very much indeed. Timothy, thank you very, very much indeed for the information again today. And I'm going to stay in this room for another 2 or 3 minutes. If anybody wants to follow the people in the room, I'll keep it open. Please do it. Have a look at the people's profiles and decide whether to follow and whom to follow. So thank you very much again. And we hope to see you at 9 o'clock in the other room about espionage in Japan.
Great. Thank you very much for hosting this room. By the way, this is a weekly room, 8 o'clock. Japanese politics. If we want to talk about, and our room is growing, we've got some people who are actually in the Japanese here publicly or privately by messaging or Maya, and we'll talk about those issues or give you an opportunity to provide your own personal insights. Much everybody for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you on the other side. I'm